We are in Senior English A, and we are working now on our hymnals on page 156, 157, and beyond. We are going to now be introduced to Boccaccio. Do you see how to spell his name on page 157? Go ahead and look at it real quickly and write it down. Look at your dates. 1350 is a good round date here, just very similar to Chaucer. Boccaccio is not English. He is Italian, as you can kind of guess by the name. Why do we look at this cat? Two reasons. One, he is very important for us to study in regards to Chaucer. Chaucer will read his Boccaccio's famous collection of stories called Decameron. Deca meaning 10. 10 stories told by another person. You can already see why that's important for Chaucer. Chaucer will use the telling of a story by another person as his way of telling a story. What do we call that? Look on page 156. Frame stories. Do you see it? A frame story is a type of narrative, are you reading it with me, in which the author creates one long story that contains within it another story or a group of stories. It's been used as literary device by writers from diverse time periods and regions. Okay? Early frame stories like those, The 1001 Nights, wove together tales from a variety of sources. Of course, Chaucer did it in Canterbury Tales. Boccaccio is considered one of the greatest at this kind of storytelling approach. All right? The story that you're going to work with today, now, number 2 reason we study Boccaccio, is what's called Frederico's Falcon. Considered, write it in your notes, one of the greatest love stories of all time. Now, when we finish at 3b, we will ask if you consider this to be a great love story. And I'll say it, it's kind of ironic that it's sometimes considered a love story, for reasons that you'll also maybe see kind of ironic at the very end of the story. All right? We're going to do what we call a close reading of the story with Miss Laird. We will read, we'll pause and jot down at level 1 what's going on. If Miss Laird is giving information, it needs to be written on the annotations. That's the reason that she's pausing, to make sure at level 1 you have enough information to perform well on the examination. You should now turn to page 158, 159, and we will be ready, of course, to begin in our background here. Read it with me on 159. 1348, a date you might want to write down in your notes real quickly. Bubonic plague sweeps Europe, killing more than half the population of Florence, including Boccaccio's parents, by the way. Are you reading it with me? The Decameron begins with a group of 10 young aristocrats, 7 women, 3 men, taking up residence in a country estate where they hope to wait out the plague in Florence. To entertain themselves, each of them tells one story a day for 10 days. The name Decameron means 10 days. Each day they elect a king or queen to preside over the day's storytelling and suggest the theme of the stories. Frederico's Falcon is told on the 5th day. Turn the page 160, and now all we're doing is just simply reading now the story, close reading, Frederico's Falcon. Thank you, Miss Laird.
From the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Translated by G. H. McWilliam. Federico's Falcon. Once Philomena had finished, the queen, finding that there was no one left to speak apart from herself, Dioneo being excluded from the reckoning because of his privilege, smiled cheerfully and said, "It is now my own turn to address you, and I shall gladly do so, dearest ladies, with a story similar in some respects to the one we have just heard. This I have chosen not only to acquaint you with the power of your beauty over men of noble spirit, but so that you may learn to choose for yourselves, whenever necessary, the persons on whom to bestow your largesse, instead of always leaving these matters to be decided for you by fortune, who, as it happens, nearly always scatters her gifts with more abundance than discretion. You are to know, then, that Copo di Borghese Domenici, who once used to live in our city and possibly lives there still, one of the most highly respected men of our century, a person worthy of eternal fame, who achieved his position of preeminence by dint of his character and abilities, rather than by his noble lineage, frequently took pleasure during his declining years in discussing incidents from the past with his neighbors and other folk. In this pastime he excelled all others, for he was more coherent, possessed a superior memory, and spoke with greater eloquence. He had a fine repertoire, including a tale he frequently told concerning a young Florentine called Federigo, the son of Messer Filippo Alberighi, who, for his deeds of chivalry and courtly manners, was more highly spoken of than any other squire in Tuscany. In the manner of most young men of gentle breeding, Federigo lost his heart to a noble lady, whose name was Monna Giovanna, and who, in her time, was considered one of the loveliest and most adorable women to be found in Florence. And with the object of winning her love, he rode at the ring, tilted, gave sumptuous banquets, and distributed a large number of gifts, spending money without any restraint whatsoever. But since she was no less chaste than she was fair, the lady took no notice, either of the things that were done in her honor, or of the person who did them.
Okay, let's do a quick recap of what's going on. A story is being presented to the queen, as we were told there was a different king or queen every day. And the story is about who? Did anybody catch his name?
Federigo.
Federigo. What's significant about him? He's considered a very honorable man. He's in love with a woman named Monna Giovanna. You're going to want to write down her name. And what is significant about her? She's extremely beautiful. A lot of things are done in her honor, but she takes no notice of it. Or of who's doing it for her either. Okay, so we are at the top of 161.
In this way, spending far more than he could afford and deriving no profit in return, Federigo lost his entire fortune, as can easily happen, and reduced himself to poverty, being left with nothing other than a tiny little farm, which produced an income just sufficient for him to live very frugally, and one falcon of the finest breed in the whole world. Since he was as deeply in love as ever, and felt unable to go on living the sort of life in Florence to which he aspired, he moved out to Campi, where his little farm happened to be situated. Having settled in the country, he went hunting as often as possible with his falcon, and, without seeking assistance from anyone, he patiently resigned himself to a life of poverty. Now, one day, while Federigo was living in these straitened circumstances, the husband of Monna Giovanna happened to fall ill, and, realizing that he was about to die, he drew up his will. He was a very rich man, and in his will he left everything to his son, who was just growing up, further stipulating that, if his son should die without legitimate issue, his estate should go to Monna Giovanna, to whom he had always been deeply devoted. Shortly afterward...
Okay. What happened to Federigo? He's buying all these gifts for her. He goes broke. He spends everything he has on her, but he's left with what? One thing he keeps from when he was wealthy.
His falcon.
His falcon. He then does what after he loses all of his money? He moves out to the country. And he's resigned to the fact that he's gonna be poor. What happens to Mona Giovanna? Her husband is dying. He writes up a will and he leaves everything to his son. Now, if something happens to his son, it goes to her. If his son doesn't have any children. That's what they mean by issue. Okay?
He died, leaving Mona Giovanna a widow, and every summer, in accordance with Florentine custom, she went away with her son to a country estate of theirs, which was very near Federigo's farm. Consequently, this young lad of hers happened to become friendly with Federigo, acquiring a passion for birds and dogs, and having often seen Federigo's falcon in flight, he became fascinated by it and longed to own it. But, since he could see that Federigo was deeply attached to the bird, he never ventured to ask him for it. And there the matter rested, when, to the consternation of his mother, the boy happened to be taken ill. Being her only child, he was the apple of his mother's eye, and she sat beside his bed the whole day long, never ceasing to comfort him. Every so often, she asked him whether there was anything he wanted, imploring him to tell her what it was, because if it was possible to acquire it, she would move heaven and earth to obtain it for him. After hearing this offer repeated for the umpteenth time, the boy said, "Mother, if you could arrange for me to have Federigo's falcon, I believe I should soon get better." On hearing this request, the lady was somewhat taken aback, and began to consider what she could do about it. Knowing that Federigo had been in love with her for a long time, and that she had never deigned to cast so much as a single glance in his direction, she said to herself, "How can I possibly go to him, or even send anyone, to ask him for this falcon, which, to judge from all I have heard, is the finest that ever flew, as well as being the only thing that keeps him alive? And how can I be so heartless as to deprive so noble a man of his one remaining pleasure?"
Okay. So what happens to the little boy? He gets sad. And he says the one thing that he would love to have is the falcon. And this is after having gone and spent much time with Federigo and becoming his friend. So now the mom's feeling a little bit of guilt. And she says, "Oh, well, I've kind of ignored him and not been so nice to him. It's gonna be weird asking him for his falcon after all this time." So that's where we're at right now. Page 162.
Her mind filled with reflections of this sort. She remained silent, not knowing what answer to make to her son's request, even though she was quite certain that the falcon was hers for the asking. At length, however, her maternal instincts gained the upper hand, and she resolved, come what may, to satisfy the child by going in person to Federigo to collect the bird and bring it back to him. And so she replied, "Bear up, my son, and see whether you can start feeling any better. I give you my word that I shall go and fetch it for you first thing tomorrow morning." Next morning, taking another lady with her for company, his mother left the house as though intending to go for a walk, made her way to Federigo's little cottage, and asked to see him. For several days, the weather had been unsuitable for hawking, so Federigo was attending to one or two little jobs in his garden, and when he heard, to his utter astonishment, that Mona Giovanna was at the front door and wished to speak to him, he happily rushed there to greet her. When she saw him coming, she advanced with womanly grace to meet him, Federigo received her with a deep bow. Whereupon she said, "Greetings, Federigo." Then she continued, "I have come to make amends for the harm you have suffered on my account, by loving me more than you ought to have done. As a token of my esteem, I should like to take breakfast with you this morning, together with my companion here, but you must not put yourself to any trouble." "My lady," replied Federigo in all humility, "I cannot recall ever having suffered any harm on your account. On the contrary, I have gained so much that if ever I attained any kind of excellence, it was entirely because of your own great worth and the love I bore you. Moreover, I can assure you that this visit, which you have been generous enough to pay me, is worth more to me than all the money I ever possessed, though I fear that my hospitality will not amount to very much." So saying, he led her unassumingly into the house, and thence into his garden, where, since there was no one else he could call upon to chaperone her, he said, "My lady, as there is nobody else available, this good woman, who is the wife of the farmer here, will keep you company whilst I go and see about setting the table." Though his poverty was acute, the extent to which he had squandered his wealth had not yet been fully borne home to Federigo. But on this particular morning, finding that he had nothing to set before the lady for whose love he had entertained so lavishly in the past, his eyes were well and truly opened to the fact. Distressed beyond all measure, he silently cursed his bad luck, and rushed all over the house like one possessed, but could find no trace of either money or valuables.
Okay, so Mona Giovanna gives in. She's like, okay, I'll go talk to him. I'll suck it up and go down there and see what I can do. She apologizes to him for not returning his love all these years. To make amends for it, she says, but I'll stay and we'll have breakfast together. What's the problem with that? He doesn't have anything. So he's running around stressed out, trying to get something nice to set before this woman he's been idolizing all these years. Anybody have any ideas about what might happen?
I read it, so I don't know. Read.
All right, we are in the middle of the paragraph on 163.
By now, the morning was well advanced. He was still determined to entertain the gentlewoman to some sort of meal, and, not wishing to beg assistance from his own farmer, or from anyone else, for that matter, his gaze alighted on his precious falcon, which was sitting on its perch in the little room where it was kept. And having discovered, on picking it up, that it was nice and plump, he decided that since he had nowhere else to turn, it would make a worthy dish for such a lady as this. So, without thinking twice about it, he wrung the bird's neck and promptly handed it over to his housekeeper to be plucked, dressed, and roasted carefully on a spit. Then he covered the table with spotless linen, of which he still had a certain amount in his possession, and returned in high spirits to the garden, where he announced to his lady that the meal, such as he had been able to prepare, was now ready.
What did he do?
He killed the falcon. And he cooked it. And he's gonna serve it to her.
It's funny, because that's what she wants.
Oh my god.
So this is, how do you think Federico's gonna react when she says, oh lovely, this is such a lovely breakfast, but I came to ask a favor. Okay, we are in the middle of 163.
The lady and her companion rose from where they were sitting and made their way to the table. And together with Federigo, who waited on them with the utmost deference, they made a meal of the prize falcon without knowing what they were eating. On leaving the table, they engaged their host in pleasant conversation for a while, and when the lady thought it time to broach the subject she had gone there to discuss, she turned to Federigo and addressed him affably as follows. I do not doubt for a moment, Federigo, that you will be astonished at my impertinence when you discover my principal reason for coming here, especially when you recall your former mode of living and my virtue, which you possibly mistook for harshness and cruelty. But if you ever had any children to make you appreciate the power of parental love, I should think it certain that you would, to some extent, forgive me. However, the fact that you have no children of your own does not exempt me, a mother, from the laws common to all other mothers. And, being bound to obey those laws, I am forced, contrary to my own wishes, and to all the rules of decorum and propriety, to ask you for something to which I know you are very deeply attached, which is only natural, seeing that it is the only consolation, the only pleasure, the only recreation remaining to you in your present extremity of fortune. The gift I am seeking is your falcon, to which my son has taken so powerful a liking that, if I fail to take it to him, I fear he will succumb to the illness from which he is suffering, and consequently I shall lose him. In imploring you to give me this falcon, I appeal not to your love, for you are under no obligation to me on that account, but rather to your noble heart, whereby you have proved yourself superior to all others in the practice of courtesy. Do me this favor, then, so that I may claim that through your generosity I have saved my son's life, thus placing him forever in your debt.
So they go and sit down, and she builds it up, Casey. And she says, you know, this is coming from a mother. If you had children, you'd understand. But my son's really sick, and the one thing he wants is your falcon. And I'm afraid if he doesn't get the falcon, he might die. Kind of putting a little bit more weight on it. How do you think Federico's going to get out of this?
Be like, I killed it.
Is he going to tell her that they ate it? And she says, I know it's so important to you. You've lost everything. This is your only consolation. But I would really appreciate it if you could do this for my son. All right, we are about to hear Federico's response, 164.
When he heard what it was that she wanted and realized that he could not oblige her because he had given her the falcon to eat, Federigo burst into tears in her presence before being able to utter a single word in reply. At first, the lady thought his tears stemmed more from his grief at having to part with his fine falcon than from any other motive, and was on the point of telling him that she would prefer not to have it. But on second thoughts, she said nothing, and waited for Federigo to stop crying and give her his answer, which eventually he did. My lady, he said, ever since God decreed that you should become the object of my love, I have repeatedly had cause to complain of fortune's hostility towards me. But all her previous blows were slight by comparison with the one she has dealt me now. Nor shall I ever be able to forgive her when I reflect that you have come to my poor dwelling, which you never deigned to visit when it was rich, and that you desire from me a trifling favor which she has made it impossible for me to concede. The reason is simple, and I shall explain it in few words. When you did me the kindness of telling me that you wished to breakfast with me, I considered it right and proper, having regard to your excellence and merit, to do everything within my power to prepare a more sumptuous dish than those I would offer to my ordinary guests. My thoughts, therefore, turned to the falcon you have asked me for, and, knowing its quality, I reputed it a worthy dish to set before you. So I had it roasted and served to you on the trencher this morning, and I could not have wished for a better way of disposing of it. But now that I discover that you wanted it in a different form, I am so distressed by my inability to grant your request that I shall never forgive myself for as long as I live.
So what does he do after she tells him this? He just starts crying. He cries so hard that he can't talk. So this is a man crying in front of the woman that he has loved for years and years and years because he is just, what is he to do? So he explains it to her after he can finally start talking again and explains what happened. And he says he can never forgive himself. So here's her response.
In confirmation of his words, Federico caused the feathers, talons, and beak to be cast on the table before her. On seeing and hearing all this, the lady reproached him at first for killing so fine a falcon and serving it up for a woman to eat. But then she became lost in admiration for his magnanimity of spirit, which no amount of poverty had managed to diminish, nor ever would. But now that her hopes of obtaining the falcon had vanished, she began to feel seriously concerned for the health of her son, and after thanking Federico for his hospitality and good intentions, she took her leave of him, looking all despondent, and returned to the child. And to his mother's indescribable sorrow, within the space of a few days, whether through his disappointment in not being able to have the falcon, or because he was, in any case, suffering from a mortal illness, the child passed from this life. After a period of bitter mourning and continued weeping, the lady was repeatedly urged by her brothers to remarry, since not only had she been left a vast fortune, but she was still a young woman. And though she would have preferred to remain a widow, they gave her so little peace that, in the end, recalling Federico's high merits and his latest act of generosity, namely to have killed such a fine falcon in her honor, she said to her brothers, "If only it were pleasing to you, I should willingly remain as I am. But since you are so eager for me to take a husband, you may be certain that I shall never marry any other man except Federico degli Alberici." Her brothers made fun of her, saying, "Silly girl, don't talk such nonsense. How can you marry a man who hasn't a penny with which to bless himself?" "My brothers," she replied, "I am well aware of that. But I would sooner have a gentleman without riches than riches without a gentleman." Seeing that her mind was made up, and knowing Federico to be a gentleman of great merit, even though he was poor, her brothers fell in with her wishes, and handed her over to him, along with her immense fortune. Thenceforth, finding himself married to this great lady with whom he was so deeply in love, and very rich into the bargain, Federico managed his affairs more prudently, and lived with her in happiness to the end of his days.
So he tells her, "I'm so sorry, I fed it to you." And she yells at him, she's like, "You're ridiculous for feeding such a fine bird to a woman." She goes home and tells her son what happened, and then what? He dies. The little boy dies. Oh, no, so there's that.
All right, stay on your annotations now, and we'll finish up. Thank you, Miss Laird. So, I think we started by saying that this is one of the great love stories. Jot down in your notes, why would Miss Laird call this a great love story? Dude, the bird gets eaten. What makes this such a great love story? What does it say about love? What do you think it does say about love? Any ideas? I mean, the guy loves the woman so much. There you go. This is going to be the key to the story, huh? What's that word? To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S word. To give everything up is what word? The S Sacrifice. Very good. We're going to write that word down. This is really a story about sacrifice. Ironically, the one thing she wants is the one thing he can't give to her because, well, he already gave it to her. She ate it. Right? What's ironic, though, in the end? What happens for him? He does get what he wants in the end, right? So what do you think is the message of the story? Any ideas? What is the final message of a story like this about love? Love is unconditional. That's a good one. Love is unconditional. That's impressive. Go ahead, Miss Grossman.
Well, I like how it said, I would sooner have a gentleman without riches than riches without a
Now
gentleman.
that's interesting. Whoa! Did you see what she says? I'd rather have a guy that picks me up on the date on his bicycle than a guy that picks me up on the date with a brand new big truck. If the guy on his bicycle was a, interesting word, gentleman. She says, I'd rather have a gentleman and no pickup truck than an amazingly beautiful truck, and the guy's not a very nice guy. And he's a jerk. Which is more important is being asked here. Put it in your own notes in your own words. What is being said here? There's a dichotomy that's being set up. What's the difference? A guy who has all kinds of money and possessions, but isn't a very nice guy, and a guy who has a really good personality and character, but doesn't have any money. Wait a minute, this is similar to the choice that the knight has to work with. I'm working now at level 3A, aren't I? This is similar to the choice the knight has to work with in The Wife of Bath's Tale. What is the choice that the knight gets in The Wife of Bath's Tale? The old woman says, you don't want to sleep with me, even though I'm your wife, because I'm butt ugly. I'm an old hag. And he goes, you got that right. And she says, well, how about this? I'll give you a choice. You can either have me as a drop-dead, gorgeous Victoria's Secret model, right? But you're always going to have to worry about me. Imagine what it's like to be married to a beautiful woman. You're always worrying, she says, when guys come over to visit. Are they going to be here to see you? Or are they going to be here to see me? How will you ever know if I'm not messing around on you? You're going to be jealous and worried. That's one choice. The other choice is to have me as butt ugly, but I'll be the most amazing woman and friend to you. I'll take care of you in every way. The knight has difficulty making the choice. Why? Why does the knight have difficulty making the choice? What is it that he understands? What's more important than looks? What's more important than a beautiful person? You got it. What's on the inside? Why? Why is that more important? Notice, the woman doesn't care that Federico doesn't have any money. She doesn't care that he doesn't have a truck because she wants a, what's the word again? Gentleman. Final question, 3B. Do you think it's still the case that girls at Worland High would prefer a gentleman over a lot of money and a nice truck? Do you think that's true?
Not really.
And what about guys at Worland High School? Do you think guys at Worland High School, when offered the choice between a beautiful woman, drop dead gorgeous, versus a woman who has good personality, which one do you think most guys at Worland High School go for? And why? You see. Uh-oh. We're making interesting observations, Miss Laird, about both guys and girls at Worland High School. All right, guys, there you go. An introduction to